Hi, this is Dr. Osesa Leavitt with another episode of the Way to College podcast. And when I started the podcast, I never knew where it was going to take me. Um, and uh, and so it's been an exciting process. It's been exciting to connect with folks in my network. But as I've shared recently, a lot of the folks that I've had on the podcast were folks that are out of my network. And today's guest is I would say network adjacent. This is someone who I think we've had one conversation prior to this, to recording the podcast, but he was somebody who was always on my radar, somebody who I was aware of sort of his journey. Just some brief context. I was on the school board for my local school district, Cal Chelsea ISD, between 2012, 2016. And I remember this young man because during one of the awards banquets, they were talking about the different students and where they were going to school. And this young man I believe, had a full ride to his institution, to the university. And for some reason, it just piqued my interest because I think it was the University of Iowa. We didn't send a lot of kids to Iowa. And so I thought, okay, there's an interesting story there. And I'd love to hear that story. And so this has been years in the making. So Jorge, why don't you do us the honors and introduce yourself to our listeners out there?
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, Jay. So my name is Dr. Jorge Moreno. I'm a graduate of Cal Chelsea in the class of 2014. I did my undergraduate education at the University of Iowa, graduated there in 2018. And then following that, I pursued my doctorate in molecular biology at Princeton University, where I just graduated this January, so January 2024. And I've now recently completed a move to Kansas City to start my new job where I'm a postdoctoral fellow, working to understand the secrets of immortality, if you will, in this one jellyfish. Yeah, we can discuss more of that, of course, but yeah. So I think that's my brief introduction. Of course, I'm an older sibling to four, who have now, the last one of which just graduated from high school. So, um, yeah.
Wow. Um, okay, so many questions now, just I think given your introduction, there's so many things that I want to ask, but Jorge, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So I ask all of my guests, if you had to identify a starting point for your own educational journey, where would that starting point be for you?
It's a great question, and one I've had some time to think about now. So I would say high school. I there's a couple of moments in my high school that I distinctly remember and call back, when I think about how I've ended up where I'm at now. Um, and if it's okay, I'll kind of hit on a couple of different one of these. Um, so the first one was, this was freshman year. I believe it was like first day of my freshman year in Texas. So of course I was a migrant student, so I didn't start back in Texas till like October or so. So I'm walking to class one day. At this point, all the students know the teachers and stuff like that, and I don't know any of the teachers yet. But I'm walking into Miss Lara's class. This is biology class. And as I'm walking in, Miss Lara's greeting everybody at the door, and she sees me and she's like, "Hey," she's like, "You're Jorge, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Oh, I've been really excited to get you into my class." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And she's like, "No, no, no. Like, I'm really excited." She goes, "I've never seen a student score as high as you did on these like exams that you take coming from junior high on the science exam." She goes, "You like nailed every single question." She goes, "I've never seen that before." She goes, "I'm really, really excited to have you in my class." And and from that moment on, I mean, Miss Lara became one of my favorite teachers. And not necessarily just because of the praise, but the way that she kind of went about teaching biology in that course. And she was one of the people who first instilled in me this idea that I was not only interested in biology and like organisms and stuff, but that I was good at it. And so that kind of kicked off my whole like, oh, what do I do with science, right? If I'm good at science and I like science, what can I do with that? And then some of the other moments, so these will kind of revolve around some teachers that I had, but Mr. Escareño was another one of those teachers who really was impactful to me. And this was around the time, so this was much later in high school, around the time when I was gearing up to figure out what I was going to do afterwards. And at the time I was kind of lost. I didn't really know where I was going to go. I didn't know what I was going to do. College was expensive. I didn't want to go to college at UTRGV. I kind of wanted to go out, and I had this like dream of like I want to go see the world. And but I was like, it's expensive. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I remember Mr. Escareño was like, no, you're like you're too qualified to just go out and waste some time and like do other things before going to college. Like you have to go straight to college. It's going to be expensive. It's going to cost money, but like, it's going to be worth it. And so I remember that he would stay with me after school. So I'd do the whole school, and then I'd go after school and I'd go into his room and we'd just work on ACT problems. Like he would just put on his smartboard on, and we just sit there and go through ACT problems. And like the dedication and time that he put into that was, to me, in hindsight, incredible. Like here I was, like some 18-year-old kid, really not knowing what was going on, right? I was kind of like, okay, I have to take these exams. That's all I know. They're going to help me. But his dedication to that really kicked off all of my future things. So I would say that, high school for me, super influential. I think if I didn't have the teachers that I had, if I didn't have these experiences, which are, isolated, but they happen multiple times throughout high school. But if I didn't have these experiences where teachers really kind of went out of their way to make me feel like I could do something, right? Like I think I always kind of knew that I was intelligent in some way, but to have
Mhm.
teachers really believe and take the time to dedicate to you and help you kind of get through these different steps was incredible. I didn't have any of that at home. My parents weren't college educated. They didn't even finish high school. And so to have these high school teachers, sit there with me and really dive into what it took to get to college, I think was super instrumental.
Jorge, thank you for sharing that. And when you're 18, or even you said freshman year, right, with Miss Lara,
Yeah.
those moments, looking back on them, I think it's easy to recognize, right, the importance of those moments and the power that they have had in our lives. But in the moment, right, when Miss Lara's talking to you and heaping all of this praise upon you, or when Mr. Escareño asks you to stay after class so that you can work on ACT problems, do you recall, what was your mindset at that time?
Yeah. Yeah, I think initially it was kind of a mixed bag of feelings towards it. I think on one end, I didn't I think on one end I really felt like they were onto something, like they know something that I don't, that kind of sensation. But at the same time, I think when you're that age and you're not really designed, or your brain's not really telling you like look forward all of
Yeah.
these, right? Look how this one moment is going to impact all these things. To me, at some points I was kind of like, why do they care? Like especially with Mr. Scareño, like this is, I go home and I tell my mom about this, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna go here and I want to go there, and like, I'm gonna apply to all these places. And my mom at home would be like, if Mr. Escudero has his own son, he can send him wherever he wants. But like, you're my son. Like, why is he telling you that you should be going to all these places? And so it's kind of, my mindset was kind of split. Where on one end I wanted to believe these things, right? Like I was kind of, I'm capable of getting all of these things. I'm capable of achieving these things and going to the places that I want to go to. And on the other hand, I'm like, well, you know what? Like, what's so special about me? Like, why is he taking this time to do this? Like what's in it for him kind of mentality, or like, what's the point? Like what if I'm not actually this good? Like what if I just let these people down? So I think
Mhm.
there's a lot going on in my head, but I think I'm more reflective on that now. When I was
Yeah.
18, I was probably just like, well, if I stay after school, like I don't have to go home yet. I don't have to go home, right? Like I can sit here and do these problems. Praise feels good from your teachers, I think. I was like, I wasn't particularly like like a straight A student. And that's mostly because I think part of my mentality was like I felt smart and I felt capable, so I wouldn't study. I like didn't pay all that much attention. I kind of just like coasted through a lot of these things. So I'm gonna guess my mentality was kind of the same there, where I was kind of like, well, it's whatever. Like I'll take an ACT. It's not a big deal, kind of thing.
I ask, and I asked that because I think you know, so there's some certain similarities. There's some similarities between what you just experienced and or what you experienced, and I think something that I experienced. So I remember as a junior in high school, rising junior in high school, I remember getting a call in the summer, and a teacher there at Ed Couch sort of just started interviewing me over the phone. This was like the beginning of the summer, and then it was like, I'm organizing this Princeton review at the high school. I'm only picking like 15 students. I want to see, like, are you committed? And I think I asked because I think I had that same mindset, like, well, I guess I'm not doing anything this summer. I guess, right? Like I was working for my father, but
Yeah.
then I thought, well, my Saturdays are free.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like I had the greatest social life. So it was like, but at the same time, it was like I couldn't see. I
Right.
and I often wondered the same thing, right? What is it about me? What do they see in me? They're willing to invest, right? Resources, time, certainly, um, in me versus maybe some other kids. And so that's what I had to ask. I think I think you're right? When in the moment, it's hard to see forward,
Yeah.
see down the road. You brought up a really great point, though. You said, your mom's reaction was,
Yeah.
well, if Mr. Scareno has a child or a son, he can send him anywhere he wants. What was the messaging? I mean, beyond that, what was the messaging? What were the conversations like at home in relation to education?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a tough, it's kind of a tough distinction, like when I recall this, because my parents always pushed education on us. Like, from the time that I can remember, third, fourth, fifth grade, it was like, do well in school. You go to school, you do your homework, they'd get home and they'd ask us. But the thing is, they could never, really help us with the homework. It was, my parents, my mom, I think if I remember right, kind of, so they went to school in Mexico, and so my mom went up until right around probably like junior high equivalent, and my dad did the same. So neither of them went to high school. Neither of them graduated from high school, and so by the time I got to junior high, high school, like it's not like I was getting help on my homework. And even early on, my parents, when we first moved to the US, like my parents didn't know English. And so when I was doing my homework, they also couldn't help me with my homework when I was younger. And so I was kind of caught in this weird way where like my parents, I distinctly remember these nights where I was working on homework and I just like I couldn't get it. And part of it was like, okay, well, I don't know the language, but the other part was like, I just don't get it. And my mom was like, what do you mean you don't get it? What are you going to school for if you don't get it? And I'm like, well, help me. And I was like, I can't help you. You got to do it yourself. Like, I can't read this, right? So they always pushed education from early on. I didn't get a ton of help from them, especially early on. And then by the time I was in high school, it was kind of like too far past what their own knowledge had been. And so it was really strange to me when it got to the point of college, and at the time I distinctly remember I would tell my mom all the time, like, oh, I'm gonna go to New York. Like one day I know I'm gonna live in like New York City. That was my thing. I don't know, I don't really remember why, but I really wanted to like live in New York City. And I was like, I'm gonna live in New York City. And so that means I'm gonna go to college. And I was like, and I want to go to these really like big places. I want to go to like MIT, or I want to go to Stanford, or I want to go to Princeton, these places. And my mom was like, oh, that's too far. Like, why are you going so far? Or like, there's no difference, and in her eyes, she's like, there's no difference between what you're going to go to do at MIT or Princeton or whatever as to what you're going to do at UTRGV. You know, she goes, so like, why don't you stay here? And at the time, I think I don't remember if at the time it was still UTPA. I think it might have been. But she was like, there's no difference between what you're going to do here and what you're going to do there. So just stay here. And my dad at some point, I think even like tried to bribe me. My dad was like, oh, if you go off there, you're going to be by yourself. You're not going to have any help. He goes, if you stay here, we'll buy you a truck. My dad was like, you stay here, we'll buy you a truck. And I was like, okay, but I was like, I don't want a truck. I want to like go and see the world. I was like, there's all these things. And so I think my mom's idea was that like my head was being filled with these messages of like, you have to leave the valley, right? Like you have to
Yeah.
get like the best education. And I don't necessarily know that that's true, but I think for me, I think that was a good thing. Like I think for me personally, like I needed to kind of I needed to leave the valley. Like I needed to see what was out there to really kind of explore and kind of get maybe a little bit get away from this similar mentality that my parents had had, which was like, this is where our life is, this is where we're going to be, kind of thing. For me, I think it was really important, but as I've kind of moved past it, it's not so much that there's a difference in education in any specific place. Like, I didn't end up going to a place like MIT, Stanford, Princeton for undergrad. I ended up going to the University of Iowa, and I'm very grateful for that experience, because I think at the end of the day, what I've really learned, I think, is that it's what you make of your time, and what you make of the education that you're getting, that's really important. I think that Iowa was the perfect place for me. I think in retrospect, like, sure, I would have loved to have the prestige of a place like Harvard, MIT, and all these other places, but I think for me, it just worked. It worked really well. And so yeah, like I said, it was just strange, having what felt like a switch for my parents, from being like, always pursue the education, always do this, and then all of a sudden being like, okay, but maybe don't pursue the education there, or like maybe don't go
Yeah.
that way. And so that was kind of strange. And I think in a slightly pushed me even further to try and get away from them, in that sense, because I was like, well, why don't you want me to go? Like maybe I need to go if you're really wanting me not to. But no, I think there's no real right way to do it. In retrospect, I think it's whatever's right for people. But I think for me that was important.
Jorge, there's so much in your response, and I agree with your comment on getting it's not necessarily maybe about getting away, right? Going away is better than not going away. But I think I always look at the students, and I always think about, right, if a student aspires, right, if they've got these big dreams and those dreams involve going away,
Yeah.
then helping the student get there, right? Helping them to nurture those dreams, I think, is important. And so I appreciate your story, and I appreciate you sort of breaking down, right, this duality of our parents really pushing for us, wanting us to do well educationally, but then because of maybe their own lack of knowledge, what does it mean to do well, when you're talking about you have all of these doors that all of a sudden are open to you, and you're like, wow, like, there's the phrase, right, the world is my oyster.
Yeah.
And absolutely, like, all of a sudden you
Yeah.
can go to a lot of these places and it doesn't seem like such a big reach. So
Yeah.
thank you for breaking that down, because I think there is some tension there, and
Great.
I appreciate how you described that for us. You said Iowa was the perfect place for you.
Yeah.
How did you find your way to Iowa?
Yeah. That's a great question. So for me, it's kind of a long story, and so I won't dwell too much on the early parts of it. So when we first moved to the U.S. As a family, and as a family unit, we were migrant laborers, so we would move from state to state looking for jobs, essentially, right? So, and this was based on whatever fruit vegetable was in season wherever, that's what we chased. And so, during the very early years, we moved between Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Iowa, and then we go back to Texas. So we'd run this little circuit kind of like across the country or around the country. And then we go back to Texas, and that's where we would, like, that was our home base, essentially. And so at some point, we ended up kind of like, we'd go less and less to the other states, and we only ended up going between Texas and Iowa. And so what this meant was I spent roughly about half of the year, a little bit less than half of the year, in Iowa every year since I was, I don't know, probably in like elementary, maybe junior high or something like that. Um, and so not only was I kind of like familiar with the place, and I kind of like liked the summers there, and like I'd be there till like right around end of October, and then we'd go back to Texas. Um, but for me, it was the school in Iowa. So the high school that I went to in Iowa, there was a counselor there I think I was a senior, when I was a senior. Um, I was thinking about colleges, and I was trying to apply to these places, and this was before the deadlines were even open and stuff like that, or before applications were due. And this counselor was like, hey, like the University of Iowa is a really great space, like a really great place, and they have a lot of cool stuff. And if you want, they have these like rolling applications. So essentially what that meant was I could apply to the University of Iowa, and I think this was like October, and I would know like right away, pretty much instantly, depending on how your scores are, how your GPA is, and stuff like that. They'll let you know right away if you're accepted or you're not accepted. And so I didn't have to wait till like, when everybody else finds out in like January, February, March. And so I was like, okay, well, you know what? Like, let's apply. Like, what's the risk here, right? So I ended up applying, and then like within a couple of hours, I got an email, and it was like, yeah, you're accepted. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. I was like, my first college acceptance, right? Like, first person I know to be accepted to a college, probably. And so, um, then the school itself, so Williamsburg High School is where I went to high school. So the school themselves, they like funded a trip for me to go to the University of Iowa, which is only like 30-ish minute or so drive from the school. So I took a day off of school, which is great, always, and I got to go visit the college campus. And because there are so many people at the school that had connections, I essentially got like a private tour of the university. I got like private meeting with some of the people there and stuff like that. And so it was just like, it was really nice. And I was like, wow, this campus is really nice. Like, I really like it. And, this was like fall. So the leaves are changing color. The campus is super pretty. I hadn't experienced the winter yet. Nobody was warning me about the winter really. But I found it to be like a really nice campus. And it wasn't until, so then I go back home, you know, I continue applying to some other places. I get some acceptances from some other places, and it's around the time when, like schools are kind of making, I guess, like financial decisions. So everybody kind of gets financial packages around the same time. And so around that time, I really had like three places that I was like really interested in. So um from those three, the University of Iowa was just like, yeah, like, look, you're, we don't really know why you applied here. Like, it seems like you're kind of like you're in like a different echelon of students. So like, we're just gonna offer you a full ride and like hedge our bets and just be like, yeah, like if you want to come here, you want to come here. And so I think I had like a pretty decent financial offer from like Michigan State, and a pretty decent, I guess for what it is of a school, like a pretty decent financial offer from Brown. But it just meant that like I was still going to end up having to pay out of pocket, like, I think it was probably anywhere between like 5 to like 10 grand a year. And it just didn't seem like financially doable for my family, right?
Yeah.
My parents were making, at the time, I think we were making like 25 to like 30,000 a year, and we're a family of six. And so like it just not like it just didn't seem possible. And so I think for me the decision was really easy. Like when I was like, well, this might be the only way that I'm going to college, right? Is if I go to Iowa. And so that's where I ended up going. And for me, I think it made the decision easier that I had familiarity with the state of Iowa. I had some people there who were connections, and especially knowing that my family was going to continue going there in the summers meant that, when school was out, I could still see my family, and I could still contribute to the family in terms of like working with them in the fields over the summer, and then just going back to school when the semester started back up. And that's what ended up happening. At least like the first year I went back and I worked again in the fields the summer following my freshman year. But then after that, kind of everything else took off.
Wow. Was the fact that it was Iowa, that you were, that your parents were still going to be making that trip, was that what convinced mom and dad to let you go?
I don't know that they were ever really convinced. I wouldn't say that they were ever really convinced. I think till the very end of it, like they I don't know if unhappy is the best word to use. They were not pleased with the idea that I was going to go to the University of Iowa. And like, I had applied to the University of Texas, and I applied to UTRGV because I think that was something that like Ed Cachosa made us do. Like, you have to apply to at least a handful of like Texas schools, right? and I'd been like automatically accepted. I'd had some financial packages from them, but like not nowhere. I think maybe UTRGV had offered me like, you know, all the money or something like that. I don't remember for sure. But to me, like Texas was never an option. Like like staying in the state of Texas was never an option. And I think that's what kind of like made my parents unhappy, is that I never really like even considered that to be a possibility. Um, I I would say that they came around eventually. I would say that they were supportive. They were supportive like once they were leaving Iowa, they were kind of like, okay, like you've already started, you know, I had already started at that point. I went to all the orientation stuff by myself. You know, I like did all these things on my own. Like it was my it was not so much that my parents were so unhappy that they weren't willing to go, you know, they were working and stuff like that. But at every step of the way before I started, they were like, "Are you sure? Like, you know, you can just go back. Like, you know, we can go back. Like, I'm sure UTRGV will just take you now and stuff like that." And so I just it was tough because I just had to keep being like, no, like I'm sure, right? Like, you know, you're second guessing my choices and stuff like that. But it was once they were leaving Iowa, you know, back, you know, at the end of the work season, that I think for them it was kind of like, okay, well, it's all or nothing on our end, right? Like either we support him fully and we're all in on this and we're happy for him, or like we're leaving him here and he's by himself and we're over there and we're not willing to be supportive of him. And so I think that that's what did it for them. I think it was the idea that I was like so committed that I was like, I'm not backing down on this, right? And I think so they came around. I think by the time the next summer rolled around and I'd like successfully done like finished my first year and stuff, I think at that point they were like, okay, kid's stubborn and like he's not listening and like he made it through 1 year, so like what's stopping him now, right? And like so
Yeah.
yeah.
Jorge, you know, thank you for walking us through that. Every uh I hear familiar stories about kids that wanted to leave. In fact, this semester I'm teaching 2 classes here at UTRGV, and I meet, it's a practice of mine. I meet with all of my students individually. I want to know their stories. And so in one class, I think about 75% of my students didn't want to be here. You know, they
Yeah.
wanted to go elsewhere. But for whatever reason, they couldn't, right? A lot of it was financial. What advice would you give somebody who's maybe like in your situation where the students have these opportunities?
Yeah.
The students are going to get really healthy financial aid packages, but mom and dad are reluctant to let them go.
Yeah.
What advice would you give that student?
Oh, it's so tough. It's so tough because you know, you know, when I was 18, it's like, yeah, be a rebel, you know, like go, you know, mom and dad, like just do it, go for it. It's your life, you know, push for it. It's so tough because I don't want to sit here and be like, don't listen to your parents, right? Like they have a lot of knowledge and they have a lot of life experience. But I will say, I kind of, I'll go with my advice would be based off of a conversation that I had with my dad a few years ago, and then following all of the kind of like Iowa happening and then being into my PhD program, I was talking with my dad one time and I kind of was just like, why didn't you want me to go? Like what was the reasoning? Like, do you not believe in me? Like, did you not think that I was capable or something? And my dad essentially said that it wasn't that he didn't believe that I could do it, and it wasn't that he didn't believe that I was like capable of doing all these things. It was that he was scared. He was scared that I would go off and I would see how harsh the real world is, right? Or see how harsh it is when you don't have your support system right next to you. This idea, and I think it's so ingrained in our culture, right? That like as Hispanics, as Mexicans, like we're so familial. Like we rely so much on our family, we rely so much on our grandparents, like big congregations of people getting together. And so his worry was that I would go off and that I would fail. And that if I failed, that was it, that my dreams would be shattered, that I would be incapable then of having these large, you know, like aspirations for myself and this belief in myself that I could do all these things, and that if I had stayed close that they could help me, that if I struggled that they would be there for me, but it was so hard for them to be there for me when I was so far away. And that kind of changed my perspective on that time, because, you know, for the longest time I thought about it from the eyes of like, I'm 18, like I have this opportunity, I want to go, and you're holding me back, is what it felt like. And really I think it was that my dad and my mom, I think, were holding themselves back. Like they weren't ready to like let go, you know, they weren't ready to push me forward and like see myself kind of have these hardships and these battles. And so I think my advice to students now, like if you were in this situation and your parents are, you know, struggling with letting you go off and follow your dreams and aspirations, you know, I would say that you have to have a conversation with them. And I know that this is tough sometimes, right? Because in our culture, it's such about respect. Like you want to respect your parents and the way that they think, but a lot of times they don't have this experience, right? And my parents didn't have this experience. And so I would say you go and you have a conversation and you talk to them and you say, look, I'm going to do this with or without you, right? But it's going to be so much easier if it's with you, if you support me through this, if you find ways to help me. And I know that like you're scared, I'm scared, but like this is what I want. And I'm just asking you to support me. I'm just asking you to believe in me, and I'm asking you to give me everything that you can to help, right? If that's, you know, going to help move me in, if that's all we can get, if that's all we can afford is like one road trip there so that you can see where I'm staying, so that you can see all these things, I'll take it. If it's just sending me care packages, like, you know, once a month, something that reminds me of home, something that reminds me of El Valle, like, do that. If it's phone calls every week, whatever it is, like, you can keep that familial support. But I think it's easing, in some way, you almost have to be the adult. You almost have to ease your parents' minds, right? And I think that is crucial because it's so much harder to do it without your parents' support. It's so much harder to do it without this familial support. It's no matter where you go, the first year of college is incredibly tough. It's hard. It doesn't matter how ready you think you are. It's hard, right? I experienced it. My siblings have all experienced it. It's hard, and no matter the support system, it's going to be difficult, and it's just easier to do it with them. So I would say have a conversation, be the adult. Like really, I think it's weird, but like at some point you have to sit your parents down and be like, okay, look, mommy, papi, like this is how it's going to be, and like you're either coming with me or you're not, right? um and it's tough, but I think that easing their minds, like it will help a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great advice. That's great advice. And I love that you shared that you had that conversation with your father after the fact. And I think a lot of parents, right? We certainly I think one thing about and really I can't speak about any other areas of the country where you've got these large pockets, right, of Mexicanos and recent immigrants, things like that. But about the Valley, I feel like we are kind of insulated and we tend to not venture out too often, right? And I see that with families and I see that with the kids and not wanting the kids to get out. So I appreciate you sharing that. You know, you said the first year of college is always tough. Tell me about your first year. What was that like for you?
Oh man, the first year, I thought about, I mean, so much self-doubt. I think I've always been, in terms of like education, I've always been a somewhat confident person, right? I've always believed that I'm capable of doing things. Nothing got as close to shattering that than my first year of undergrad. I mean, it was brutal. I remember I was taking calculus, I was taking chemistry, I was taking biology, I think psychology or something like that. And at the time, you know, I wasn't in these like college readiness courses, you know. So and I'm grateful now that a lot of places have these college readiness courses. You're required to take them, and they'll help you kind of acclimate to studying and stuff. But I had none of that. I mean, I was for lack of like better words, but I was like a cocky high school student, right? Like I hadn't studied in high school. I had barely broken a sweat for most of the things in high school. So here I was in college, and I was like, well, it's gonna be the same thing. You know, I'm smart, you know, I'm intelligent like this. I'm just gonna walk into these classes, I'm just gonna listen to lectures, and then I'm gonna go to the exams and I'm gonna ace them. And I come out of my first exam, I think, for chemistry, and I've got like a C plus. And I was like, well, I was like, that's not how that happens for me, right? Like that's not how that's supposed to go. Um, And I was like, well, I was like, maybe everybody got a C plus. You know, everybody got like a 70 on this exam. Nope. Bunch of kids had like 90s and stuff. And I was like, okay, cool. I was like, it's a fluke. Like it's a fluke. I was off. And so I, going into midterms, I take another exam. I come out of the exam, another like C. And I was like, okay. I was like, well, that's not great. Like now I'm like struggling. Now I feel like I'm not capable, like I'm not smart enough to do this. And this kind of like snowballed because instead of asking for help, instead of like trying to figure out how can I improve my study habits, I kind of went into this, and I don't think that the weather helped, right? Like at this point we're like into winter, it's like getting dark early. I'm not used to this. It's cold. At this point I started, you know, spiraling a little bit, and I started being like, well, okay, well, I'm just not cut out for this, so what's the point in trying? What's the point of like, going to tutoring or going to this or going to that if I'm just going to get a C anyway. And so at some point, I think you start blaming everything else. And it's like, well, the teacher's not good. Like I'm not learning because the professor's not teaching me well, and all these other kids, like they already knew this from before. And so I stopped showing up to class, and I'm like, I'm not really putting in my effort, because at this point I'm just kind of like, well, what's the point? So I'm thinking about dropping out. Like I'm like, I don't like it here. It's cold, it's dark all the time. Like I'm bad at school. Like I thought I was supposed to be good. The only thing that I've ever been like really good at is like I'm not good at anymore. So like, what's going on? Well, I get through the semester, luckily. I think I end up with like a 2 point, maybe like a 2.9 or something like that semester or something like that. Um, and I get an email from like the university, maybe one of the deans, maybe something like that, financial office or something, that I have to maintain a 2.8 GPA. If I don't maintain at least a 2.8 GPA, then I lose my scholarship. And so at that point, I'm like, huh, well, that's not good, right? Like if I lose my scholarship, I can't pay for school, right? Um, I'm out of state at the University of Iowa. Tuition was like $45,000 a year, and like all of this was covered, but like I there's no chance that I could ever afford this tuition. So at that point, I really start thinking about dropping out. Okay, well, do I transfer? Like maybe my parents were right. And this is the thing this is what like the thought that really gets you, right? Is like maybe my parents are right. I'm not cut out for this. Like I should have never gone there, right? Maybe it's time to just transfer back to UTRGV, um, and just like try my luck here, and it'll be better. Like it'll go better, it'll be easier, like I'll do well, whatever, and I can still then aspire to do the things that I want to do after college, which at the time I think was medical school. And I think at that point I was like, well, if I have a 2.9 GPA, like I'm never getting into med school now, right? Like you're always told like you have to be perfect. You have to have a 4.0 every single semester. Like you have to be absolutely perfect to get to med school. So I was like, well, I'm not going to med school now. What's the point? I should just go back to UTRGV. I should just do whatever. It's fine. My life is over. It's no big deal. That's kind of like the spiraling that I ended up into. And so I go back for my second semester. I end up going back for my second semester. It gets a little bit better. I think I end up going to some tutoring. I end up kind of like reaching out to these like places, and I end up like trying to pay more attention in class, this and that. I think I ended up, by the time I ended my first year, I think I was probably like hovering right around a 3.0, maybe like 2.9 still or something like that. I think, and it was crazy because then at that point I was like, well, I finished my first year, so it's okay. Like we're doing well. Like we still have a scholarship, and we didn't drop out, so this is great. Like A plus technically for me, right? Um, but that first year, like not that it haunts me, but it lives with me because it really pushed me, I think, to the most that I'd ever been pushed in any sense academically, right? And probably even to now. Like I've done a whole PhD, and I think even to now, I think the PhD never felt like as much stress as I had being an 18-year-old, probably crying myself to sleep, being like, I'm gonna lose this scholarship, like I'm gonna like, I'm not cut out for this, you know, what am I doing here, kind of thing. Um, and so it was tough, but I learned a lot from it, I think. I think it pushed me to really think more carefully about like what I was doing there, like how grateful I was for that opportunity. Um, again, like you go to a place like this, you know, I was no slouch in terms of like education and stuff, but at the same time, like they're paying for all of my school. Like I have all my school paid for. How many kids would not, you know, kill for the opportunity to be in this position? And so I think that's what kind of reset my brain, where I was like, okay, we're not a quitter. You know, we've been through tough things. Like this is just another thing in life that you have to get through. And if this is what you want, like this is, you have to fight for it. Like you have to go for it. Um, and just appreciate that you're in this position, and like do the best that you can with it. And I think that that really helped. And of course there was a lot of other things that happened during my time at Iowa, you know, past my freshman year, that really kind of set me on the right course. And have helped me get to where I was at. But I think that mentality shift during the first year of just being like, yeah, this is tougher than I thought it was going to be, for sure. Like it's time to like really buckle down and get serious about this, right? Otherwise I'm gonna have to leave, right? And
Yeah.
that was a no-go for me. Like, you know, I think a lot of people go to college and you kind of like, well, if I flunk out, I flunk out, or if I have to drop out, I drop out, you know. I can do this or I can do that. For me, it felt like it was all the way back to the bottom, right? If I flunk out of this, like I'm going to be a migrant laborer for the rest of my life. Like that's what it felt like. And to go from having these dreams of like I can go to med school to like I'm a migrant laborer for the rest of my life. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but for me it was that tumultuous fall just felt like undoable. I was like, I can't do it. Like I'm
Yeah.
gonna fight for this, you know.
Wow. You you recover.
Mhm.
You get how long would you say it took you to feel like, okay, I've kind of gotten my bearings here. I can do this, and I feel confident doing this.
Yeah, I think it was like halfway through my second semester. Think about halfway through my second semester, you know, springtime is rolling in. I made some good friends. I like connected with some people. I made a really good friend who he was a year older than me. He was a like straight A student. Like spent most of his time studying. No life, right? Like no life outside of that. So no, but seriously, like he spent a lot of time studying. Like he was really serious about it. And I think seeing him, really, it was like it was this idea of like meeting somebody who's like more dedicated, smarter than you know, and wants it. And you look at this, and I think there's really a couple ways that you can react. I think one way is to kind of like shelter even more and be like, oh my God, like I really am not like that. Or to kind of be like, okay, that's what I want to be like. That's what we're going for. And so I just kind of like stuck by his side. I was kind of like, cool, like you, it's me and you, right? Like I'm gonna learn your study habits. I'm gonna like have the same drive, dedication, and I'm gonna be like, I want to become like a 4.0 like straight A student now. And it was great. Like he's my best friend now. Like we've been friends for a long time now. Um, and it's a really good friendship. But I think that, you know, that happened. And then around that same time, I ended up reaching out to like a faculty member to do like research in her lab, and that also helped. And I think that all of these things like together really like pushed me to like have that mentality back of like, okay, I belong here. I can do this work.
Oh man, that's awesome. That's awesome. Jorge, you said you wanted to do, your thoughts were aspirationally thinking, I'm going to go to medical school. You graduate from Iowa. And how did you find your way into a PhD program at Princeton?
Yeah. So this is, you know, same around the same time when I met this friend, and then ended up um reaching out to this professor. So her name is Dr. Neiman. Um so I reached out and we had like a little like interview in her office, and she was like, okay, so like why do you want to do research? And I was like, well, my grades aren't so good, right? And I know that medical schools like when you have like these extracurriculars like research on your resume. So that's why I want to do research. And like in retrospect, I'm like, I don't understand why she ever took me with that mentality of like, I'm only doing this so I can like look better on paper kind of thing. But she did. She was okay. She's like, well, we'll do it. Like you can go ahead and start in the lab. And initially, my work in the lab was just kind of like typical like undergrad research responsibility. So I was in charge of feeding the snails. So she works on snails. My job was just to feed the snails. So I'd come in for like an hour, 2 hours a week, and I'd feed the snails, and that was like my research responsibility, right? So it's not really like, research per se, but this is like a lot of the entry level things sometimes. And so what ended up happening was like as I spent more time in the lab, I'd come in for an hour to feed the snails. And then the next time, I'd come in and I'd hear somebody talking about something science wise, and I'd be like, oh, well, I'm kind of interested in that. So I was like, I'd feed the snails quickly and I'd run over and I'd like sit there and I'd listen to them talking. And then, every once in a while I'd ask questions like, oh, like, is that like this thing I had heard about in class? And they're like, yeah, it's like that, but we also do this and this and this. And I was like, oh, this is cool. Okay. And then I'd like, okay, I have to run a class. So I'd run a class. But then I'd finish with class and I was like, well, I don't want to go to back to my apartment. I was like, I want to go back to the lab. Like I want to go talk to these people. So I kept doing this. So I ended up spending a bunch of time talking to, graduate students, to a bunch of like the other undergrads that were in the lab, and then to Maureen, to Dr. Neiman. I ended up talking a lot with her. And so the summer the summer of my so when I was a rising junior, so this, the summer between my sophomore and junior year, I didn't end up actually working with my parents. I ended up doing research. So we had like she applied on my behalf for this thing called an NSF-REU. So it's the National Science Foundation's research experience for undergrads. So essentially it's a funded position. So you get paid to do research over the summer, which for me was a big thing, right? Like my summers, if I wasn't getting paid, it was a wasted summer, right? Like we needed to have like money. There needed to be money somehow. Um, which is, a whole mentality thing, right? Like it's a whole like, growing up the way that we did, you're up poor. It's like you don't just volunteer your time. You can't just we don't have that luxury, right? And so for me, that summer really, really like kicked off the whole research thing because I was like, well, I just spent my entire summer working, and it was something that was like it was like education in a sense where like I was learning a lot, but it wasn't a classroom learning. And there was no failing. Like you could fail and there was nothing was wrong when you failed. Like and to me that was the craziest thing. I'd like lived at that point my almost my entire life being so afraid of failure. Failure was terrible. If you failed, that's it. Like you've done something terribly wrong and like there's no coming back from it. But in research, like failure is a way of learning. And it was like I remember an experiment didn't work and I was there and I was just sad and I was like, well, it didn't work. And they're like, well, you can just do it again. Like, you can take the last one that failed and you can change something about it and you can try it again. And I was like, okay. And so I tried it again and it failed. And they're like, okay, but learn from that one. And I did it again and then it worked. And I was like so excited when it worked. I was like, oh my God, I got it to work. And they're like, yeah. And then to them, it was so commonplace, and to me, it was like, but I failed. Like, why didn't I like I can still succeed even though I failed all these other times? And they were like, yeah, it's learning experiences. And so I like really fell in love with research. Like I'd fallen in love with science at that point. I really like science. I really like math, all these STEM things. But at that point, I really fell in love with research. This ability to just like try things, learn, try them again, learn, try them again, succeed. And there's no real answer. Sometimes there are answers, but a lot of the times you're just learning more and more and more. And you learn something and you take that, what you've learned, this answer, and you take what you learned to ask a new question. And that was beautiful to me. I was like, oh, I'm never stopping learning, right? Like you're always going to learn here. And so I remember after that summer, I asked Maureen, I was like, okay, I was like, so how do I get your job? because that summer I watched her. She like traveled to Croatia for a conference, and then she went to England to see a friend of hers, and they like did some stuff together in a lab. And then she came back, and then she'd like come in whenever she wanted. Like she'd come in at like 7 a.m., but she'd leave at 2 p.m. And like I was like, this job is great. Like I was like, how do you have this job? Right? Because you work your own hours, you get to travel everywhere. I was like, you get to talk with really smart people all the time about science that you care about. Like, how do I become you? Right? How do I get your job? And she's like, oh, you have to do a PhD. And I was like, what's a PhD? And she's like, oh, like it's you get a doctorate in like a field. And I was like, okay, but how do I do that? And she's like, oh, you have to go to graduate school. And I was like, where are they? Like, where are the graduate schools? She's like, here, like, these students here, the students here are PhD students. And I was like, oh, so I can just stay here. She's like, no, 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 don't stay here. She goes, we'll work on all of this. She goes, but you're gonna go somewhere else. Like you're gonna go do graduate school and you're gonna do really well and like you'll do research and you'll find your stuff and things like that. And that really set off the whole grad school thing. And then she was incredibly helpful. I mean, I again, similar to how I ended up, going to undergrad, I knew nothing about graduate school, and she really guided me through that whole process. And there's a couple of other programs involved. Like she got me into this other program, which was kind of like designed to help students find grad schools that they like and like do more research and get paid for research. And so that was really great. But really, she was the driving force behind me ending up at a graduate program. And she helped me look for graduate programs and connected me with like faculty friends of hers, which was crazy because I was an undergrad at that point. I was maybe like 21 years old. And I'm having like Skype meetings at the time. Skype was a thing. This is pre-COVID. And so I'm having Skype meetings with faculty members at different universities, like full-fledged faculty members. And I'm sitting in there like, just like sucking up what they're telling me, just like soaking it all in. And a couple of them are still my friends to this day, which is, like I'll talk to somebody and they're like, oh, do you know so and so? And I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm friends with them. Like I have their number, and they're like, you have their number? And I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I met them like years ago. Like we've been friends for years. I have all these like professor friends now. I'm not a professor yet. I hope to be one someday, but I'm not a professor yet. But I have all these other professor friends, and it's super fun because I'm like, I'll publish something, or they went like, recently when I published a paper, they'll publish something and I'll text them. And my friends are like, wow, like you just have these people on your phone. I'm like, yep. I'm like, I'm just cool like that. But no, so that really set me off and off onto the path of like getting a PhD. And then I ended up at Princeton. So I applied to a couple places, interviewed at a couple of these places, and then yeah, I ended up picking Princeton just because I really liked the faculty that I was going to work with and the research that we were going to be doing. I thought was like a really good fit for me and what I wanted to do.
Jorge, there's so much there. I love it. Thank you, because, you know, I work primarily with first year students, and I think a lot of times we get into college and we go in kind of with tunnel vision. Like I know of 5 careers, and these make money, and I'm going to do this, right? And I always encourage the work that I do a lot of is kind of encouraging students to kind of open their, just open your perspective, look at different things, and even within particular fields, there are a lot of different things that you can do that you didn't know existed, right? And so I love your story because in a lot of ways you were following a traditional path, doing the med school thing. I need to do research. It looks good on my resume. My grades maybe aren't up to par, right? But along the way, here you are, curiosity is sparked within you, and you start to sort of soak it in, and I want to be a part of these conversations and hear these things. Great. You have conversations with people who know, right? How do I get your job? Because your job seems cool, right? But then also picking up mentors along the way, getting information, and the whole point I think of my podcast is like, one, things rarely happen in a straight line, right? And so seeing you, hearing you put your path together, right? This is happening to me. This is great. I want more of this. How do I have these experiences, right? So thank you so much. You go to Princeton,
Yes.
you earn a PhD, and let me ask you, Because I can tell you, so I started working before I did my PhD, worked, I think 4 years before I started mine. But even then, I did the PhD, and there are expectations once you get the PhD, you're going to do this and you're going to apply to get tenure track professor, right? I wasn't sure that I wanted to do that. For you, was it always, I want to do what Dr. Neiman's doing? Or has that changed at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it started that way. And I think right now I'm kind of in the same spot. Like, I want that tenure track faculty position. Like, I want to be like Dr. Neiman, right? Like, that was my goal for going to grad school. And in grad school, I mean, a lot happened while I was in graduate school, both like, personally in my life, but also in the world, right? Like, we had a whole pandemic while I was in graduate school.
Yeah.
So I think my perspective has shifted a lot in terms of like my mentality about life and what I want. And I think you said, I think about this sometimes where like it's not linear, right? Like I think from the outside perspective, I think when people think about, me, or people who know me now think about me, they're like, well, Jorge's life has been very linear, right? Like, he went to high school, he went to undergrad, he went straight to graduate school after undergrad, like now he went straight to this position. Like, of course it seems linear, right? Like, but it's really not. And I think that the pandemic really helped, both the pandemic, but also my experiences in graduate school helped reshape my mentality once again about kind of what I want, and how much of my intrinsic value I place into that want. And by that, what I really mean is, when I started graduate school, I was gung ho about it. I was like, I'm going to be a faculty someday. I'm going to be a faculty, and I'm going to have my own research lab. And then the pandemic happened, and I kind of was like, well, there's a lot more things that are important in life than a PhD or a faculty position or a research lab, or anything that I really do. There's so much more that's important: family time, spending time with friends, seeing loved ones, having that free time to really be human, to like to be alive. And then, watching my own advisor at the time. So he had just started his lab, so I was his first PhD student. And watching him navigate the early years of being a faculty member, you're trying to get tenure. It's 5 to 6 years of just constant stress. I mean, like, every day, every decision that you make, every dollar that you spend is kind of like, you're teetering on, like, is this helping or hurting me get tenure, right? Am I getting closer or further away from a publication? Am I getting, closer or further away from tenure? That level of stress is not for everyone, for sure, and I don't even know if it's for me, right? Like, I enjoy, I'm trying to enjoy as much as possible, my life and the career stage that I'm currently at, because I think so much of my life I've spent it kind of looking forward. I've always spent it kind of like focusing on the next step. And I think graduate school helped reset that for me, because I was just like, okay, I'm just going to finish graduate school, and then I'm going to do a postdoc, and then when I do a postdoc, I'm going to go to be a faculty member, and then when I'm a faculty member, I'm going to get tenure, and then when I get tenure, blah blah blah, blah, over and over and over again. And at some point I was like, I'm right where I want it to be. Like, 5, 10 years ago, you asked me, you tell me then, that 18-year-old kid, that I'm right here right now. And that 18-year-old kid goes, oh my God, yeah, we did it. Like, we made it, And you talk to me right now, and I'm like, no, 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 we're not even close. We're all these steps away. And so I've been lucky enough now, I think, to be in a very privileged position where I can kind of like sit back, take a breath, and think about what I've accomplished so far and what that means. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff left for me to do, and there's a lot of things that I still want in my life, and that I still want to accomplish career wise. But I think I've managed to at least a little bit kind of untangle my own personal kind of aspirations and career goals from my personal view of my self-worth, right? Where I think previously I was so, if I was like, oh, if I don't get a faculty position, that means I did something wrong along the way. I failed at something along the way, right? Either I wasn't a good enough grad student, or I wasn't a good enough postdoc, or, if I don't get tenure, I'm not a good enough researcher or professor. And so I think now I'm like, I still want that. I want to be a faculty member. I want that really badly. That's what I'm striving for. That's what I'm working really hard for now. But if it doesn't happen, it's okay. Like I have a PhD. There's so many more job opportunities for me that I'm learning more about them. You hear about industry, or you hear about consulting, and you hear about these things, and I'm like, okay, are they for me? I don't know, because I've never tried them. The only thing I've really tried is research, right? And I'm sure that I am capable enough that if research doesn't pan out for me, if I don't end up in a faculty position and tenure track faculty position, you know what? I'll go try it. I'll go try industry for a couple of years. There's a lot of different industries. There's a lot of different companies. You know, the first one might not be right, but a different one might. I'll go try consulting, who knows? Maybe I really like that. There's a lot of writing jobs that you can take. There's a lot of outreach jobs. There's so many things for me to do that, I think I I think now I'm okay in an okay spot where I'm like, if it doesn't happen, it's okay, but it is what I want. Like I'm striving for it. I'm working hard towards it, but that's not all, right? Like you can't just work so hard that everything kind of falls into place. And I think that has become very clear to me now. And so I'm going to work as hard as I can, but if it doesn't come about, it wasn't for me, like I'll go do something else. There's a lot of jobs out there, and they're going to pay me just as well as any other. So, I but yes, I think in short, yeah, like it's still what I want. And then I think if you looked at me before starting my PhD and you look at me after, it's still true. But if you look at the in between, it's kind of gone everywhere. And I think that it's a good microcosm of what my life has been. You look at early and end right now, or where I am at right now, not end, but if you look at where I am right now, you're like, wow, look at that. Like just a straight line to where he wanted to be. And then you look at everything in between and you're like, no, like that's not how it works at all, right? But it's hard, having that foresight. You have no idea where your next decision is going to take you. And so I think I'm really grateful for where it has taken me. And I think that, I think that sometimes it's okay to kind of take a step back and appreciate kind of how far you've come. And so I think that's a little bit of what I'm trying to do, or at least be more cognizant of that now, instead of kind of just, you know, getting lost in what my future is going to be.
Yeah. Jorge, yeah, I want to be mindful of your time. And I still have plenty to ask you, but I know when we talked, we committed to an hour. So what I'd like to do is get some, I think words of advice from you. And then if possible, maybe we can set up another time because I'd love to hear about the work that you're doing and how you found your way there. But then also, what you have, because you've kind of become a trailblazer for your own family. And maybe we can talk about that. So, keeping, your time in mind, what final piece of advice or what piece of advice would you like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for giving me the time and the space to chat and tell my story. First of all, I really appreciate it. It's always nice to reminisce on this kind of stuff and be able to share this with people. And I hope it impacts people positively. I hope that people get something out of this. And yeah, I feel like I'm not really great at like final pieces of advice and words like that. So I okay, I will say, maybe my best piece of advice, and it's something that I've tried to do, is kind of is follow where like your curiosity takes you, um and like go all in, like always. I think so many people kind of, will hedge and it's, think about safer options and backup plans and this and this and that. I think if you go for it, if you follow what you want to do, if you follow your dreams, you follow what makes you curious, and you go all in on it, I think you can't go wrong. Um, you
Mhm.
will follow along somewhere where you want to be. I think there's like a better way of saying this, and I think I remember this in like classrooms in like elementary or something, where you're like, shoot for the moon or for something, and if you fail, you'll still land among the stars. But I really do feel like that is the case, right? Like something of that sort, but you really have to like go all in, believe in yourself, and just like go for it. Uh, Things will
I love
follow.
that. I love that. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's good advice. Jorge, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing part of your story, because I know there's still a little more, and I'm eager to continue the conversation. But for this first part, thank you so much for sharing your story.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really nice.
Excellent. This is Dr. Cesar Olivar, and this concludes another episode of Way to College podcast. Thank you to my guests. Thank you to our listeners out there. Please remember to subscribe, rate the podcast, please. That helps out the podcast a lot. And then do me the favor and don't forget to share the podcast with one other person. I'd appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.